Hello everybody and welcome to IWM TV. I'm David Poxon, I'm the organiser of IWM and I'm also a painter in my own right. And today I'm going to do a little demonstration for you just to get things going and to get you all in the mood. I'm a painter in pure watercolour. And what does that mean? That means I use mainly transparent pigments, occasionally some opaque pigments. I work from light to dark and I don't use any white paint. I preserve the white of the paper because in my opinion you cannot get whiter than the white of the paper. I also don't use any black paint. So any darks I use are usually a combination of mixes. Just to explain a little bit about my setup, this is what we're going to be painting today. It's a door to a secret garden. I've prepped the paper. The paper, by the way, that I use is Bockingford 200-pound weight knot surface, or 425 gram. It's made by a company called St Cuthbert's Mill, which is based in the south of England. So I've prepped the paper. Now, I like to have things very organised. Because I'm right-handed, I want all the materials I'm going to use to be on the right of me. My palette, which is an old paint tin with pans in it. Most of them have already been used up, but when they're used up, I just use tube paints and squeeze tube paint into the palettes, and off I go again. Nice big water bowl, clean water. Saucers, ceramic saucers for mixing large washes. Another vital tool I use is a thing called a pipette, and I use the pipette to transfer water from the water bowl to the saucer. That way I don't have to keep dipping my brush in the water and transferring water backwards and forwards. There's paint on the brush. Before you know what's happening, you're in a world of pain because the water's dirty and you've wasted a load of paint. So we don't want to do that. Today I'm going to use a very limited palette, which I'll describe when we come to the painting part, and 3 or 4 brushes. A limited set of equipment, limited palette, and hopefully you'll enjoy what I'm going to do. First job is going to be to preserve areas of white paper. For that I use something we call masking fluid, and I prefer this thin blue masking fluid, which is actually made by a company called SAA based in England, but you can get thin blue masking fluid from several firms. I don't like the thick white fluid because I find it impedes the run of the paint. It's difficult to get off, and also because it's white you can't see where you've put it on the paper. With blue you can. So I'm going to very quickly mask areas of the white paper. For that I'm going to use just an old paintbrush handle, dip it in the masking fluid and roll it round on areas where I want to preserve the white paper. The thing about masking fluid is it's better to use less than you think you might need, because it can take over. See, I'm being quite random with the application of the masking fluid. We're going to get some lovely grains in this wooden door a bit later on. So I'm just scraping this paintbrush handle down the paper. I'm also going to spatter some of this. It gives me lots of little dots of masking fluid. Another nice effect. If you come to an area that you think, well, I don't want to put a great big area of masking fluid on the paper because we want to use less rather than more, you can use pieces of card or old watercolour paper, get them randomly into shape and stick them on into an area where you want to preserve some white paper, and we'll take those off after as we move through the painting process. Also quite a large section you can actually get quite accurate when you're flicking masking fluid or paint, so this might look like chaos, and it probably is, but never mind. Okay, I think that's probably enough masking for now. If I put too much masking fluid on, I don't worry about it, because when we take it all off, we can see if it's too much white paper, I can just glaze over those areas and lose the white stuff. So in some ways it's better to have more than less, but it's personal choice. So we now need to pause and let this dry completely before we go to the next stage, which is the first painting application, a nice big wild wash, and things are going to get really great. See you in a few moments. Okay, this is where things start to get exciting. My masking fluid has dried. I've partly prepared my first saucers of wash using yellow ochre and Schminke Cerulean Helion. Most of my paints are Schminke. I find them a very pure pigment, manufactured in Germany, and the consistency is perfect. In other words, every time you have a new tube of paint, it's exactly the same colour as the one before, mostly. So, mixing my first wash, I'm going to transfer water from my water bowl to my saucer, in which I've got some yellow ochre. And I'm also going to transfer some to my saucer where I've got some cerulean blue. Beautiful colour. And my first wash, I'm aiming for the consistency of a milk. I don't want a very thick paint, I want quite thin. I use a multi-layering technique where I put many layers of paint, one on top of the other, each one gradually modulating the colour beneath to create a whole new range of colours. That way I have a whole rainbow of colours in my paintings, even though I just use a few limited colours, a limited palette. Right, so I'm ready. I'm going to mix up my yellow ochre, the first one to get onto the paper. And I'm going to use another brush, a flat, to mix up some of my cerulean blue. Notice my water bowl is still clean water. By this time, usually, if you watch other painters, their water bowl will be coloured with lots of paint that they've put in, and, well, I don't know how they manage, but never mind. So, first thing is yellow ochre, and here we go. Roughly following the perspective of these paving stones at the entrance to this door. Even at this stage of the painting, those that are familiar with my work will know that texture is very important to me in my work. I love texture, and I love trying to create the illusion of texture on the paper. So even at this point, I'm thinking about texture and how I can create that illusion. Okay, so I've got some yellow ochre on. Now I'm going to get some of this lovely cerulean blue. And I'm going to take that colour into the yellow ochre mix off at the top of our painting. Where the cerulean is meeting the yellow ochre, it creates a third colour, which is a beautiful greeny blue turquoise. Wonderful colour. A few little random splashes. Okay, so now I'm going to get some yellow ochre which is a thicker mix, and I'm going to spatter some of this into the stonework. When you spatter, always have the brush at right angles to your finger. Have a tissue near, because for some reason it doesn't work on a wet finger, so you have to keep continuously drying your finger. Spatter at right angles, and we're aiming for lots of tiny little dots. You can catch that, you can see some coming here. So this is thicker yellow ochre paint hitting the thinner wash that's on the paper. Best brushes to do this with are hog's hair brushes, which are normally used by oil painters, but just because oil painters use them doesn't mean we can't. I'm now going to do a thing called a drop-in wash, where you load your brush up and drop it in. Drop-in wash technique. Again, you can get, if you practice this a lot, you can get quite accurate with where you're dropping the paint. While that's there, I'm going to get some burnt sienna. Consistency of cream. Bit thicker than milk. Dry my finger, and I'm going to spatter that up into this area here. And look at these beautiful effects already starting to happen. If you can get the painting to paint itself, it's even better than doing it yourself. Lovely rich dark starting to appear now, where the paint, three colours are merging together there, creating a whole other world of colour. Some on our paving slabs at the bottom. Drop in wash. So you see, although we'll end up with quite a tight painting, I am a realist painter and I want my work to look like real things, out of respect I feel for the subjects that call me. But at the same time, there is a lot of abstract application going on, where I kind of know what's going to happen, and I'm going with the flow, and I'm enjoying the wildness of the first applications of paint. It's probably enough for this stage, but before we pause and let this dry, I'm just going to rock the board, which will encourage runs, and also some of the pigments are granulating pigments, where the particles of paint medium are quite fine and they will fall into the hollows of the paper, creating a kind of granulated, mottled effect, which is a kind of texture. And I'm now going to let this dry. We'll let this dry flat, let the paint make friends with the colours make friends with other colours, and see you in a few minutes. Okay, so the first wash is almost dry. It's in a kind of sticky state. While it's in this state, we can do certain things to it to start to illustrate the illusions of texture. And I use this little implement, which I think is something to do with sewing. And if you stick it, it's not sharp, it's a blunt end, stick it into the paint and move it round, we can simulate little scratches and little bits of peeling plaster. You can only do this while the paint is wet. At the same time, we can get quite detailed with this. It's good fun, actually. The danger is, of course, that you could do too much of it, but beautiful area there that's developing, and this is lovely here. Some nice detail in that down here, and we'll follow some of the perspective lines of our paving stones, all worn. What we're trying to simulate is hundreds and hundreds of years of history. And this is a medieval wall, a medieval door from somewhere in France, and it's been battered by the weather, by the rain, by the cold, by the heat, and by people. And we're trying to recreate that on a piece of paper and get some of its DNA. And to do that, we can attack the paper. Now, Bockingford is quite tough, and it does take, Bockingford paper does take a fair bit of abuse, which is useful when I'm painting. You can also use your nail to scratch into the paint and create some nice marks, and just enjoy these first stages of a painting. We can get tight later, and as we refine the painting and make it look like the thing we're trying to paint, but at the moment just enjoy the process. Okay, we just let that settle off for a few moments, let it dry completely, and then we'll go for our second glazing applications. See you in a minute. Okay, so our first wash is dry. We've done a little bit of texturing with that tool I had, which I call impressing, by the way. And now it's time for our second application of wash. And I'm going to use some of the yellow ochre again, and I'm going to glaze over gently. Not going to press down on the brush, I'm just going to let it float across the surface, and you can see the colours beneath starting to shine through. We're also, in doing this, building tonal depth. So our second layer of colour. Not pressing down, I'm just letting the brush float across the surface. You need to get a good feel for this. Again, just float it up over the burnt sienna, and it's already creating some beautiful texture effects. Leaving little gaps here and there. Nice golden colour appearing where the yellow ochre is floating on top of the burnt sienna that is underneath it. And now I'm going to get some of the cerulean blue, swap brushes, cerulean blue, and reinforce our door area, gently pulling it down, vertical strokes. And we'll come off the door area into our paved area, creating nice shadow effects and a beautiful luminous green. Don't be afraid to use your finger if you feel you can, and you can just pull the paint around with your finger, scrape your nail in, create some more effects. And now it's time for some more texture. I'm going to use some more yellow ochre, just like we did in the first wash, second application of texture. Nice amounts of spattering. Look at that, beautiful. Now I've got here some cobalt blue. Neat cobalt blue. I'm going to go into this area over here with some spatter, just to give us a little suggestion of some dark crevices in the peeling plaster and masonry that surrounds this medieval doorway. Back to our main door, some neater cerulean. Strange thing is, this cerulean blue, when it's in the palette, it doesn't look anything like the colour that it's going to end up with. Look at the difference between that and this. This is beautiful. This looks a little harsh. And that's the reason. Well, actually, the explanation for that is because schminky paints are pure. It's the essence of pure colour. Each pan of schminky paints takes 4 months to make. A tiny little pan takes 4 months while the pigment is evaporated and filled, the pan is filled again, and so on. So what you get with schminky is extremely pure colour, and that's why it goes a long way. First suggestions of this shadow area on the door. I don't know if you can see this, the camera picks this up, but this cobalt blue that I'm spattering on is sitting on top of the yellow ochre, which is still wet underneath. It's just sitting on top, floating on the top, and it's creating its own 3D imagery, even in this tiny little area here. Now, a brush, don't just use the bristle end of the brush, you can also use the other end of the brush, and you can make some marks in the paint with that. So use every piece of equipment that you've got. Okay, so I'm just going to rock the board and let this paint move around. Now I'm going to place the board flat, and I'm going to let that dry completely before we come back for our next part of this demonstration. See you in a couple of minutes. I've let my paper and paint dry naturally, and if you have time, it's always better to let that paint dry naturally rather than using a hairdryer. The reason is, when you use a hairdryer, it does affect the paint and it bakes it a little bit and turns it a little bit shiny. So obviously, if we were doing the live show at Lilleshall Hall right now, everyone's having to paint within an hour their demos, so using a hairdryer they have to do it. But you at home, enjoy yourselves, paint along, take your time, leave the world outside the door and just enjoy the process. Now, the next stage of this, I'm going to do a little bit of work on our door. And the first thing I'm going to do is I've got here a T-square and I have two pieces of wood like this. I put the pieces of wood at each end of the board and the T-square on top. Use a rigger brush, paint the thickness of cream. Nice sharp point on the brush. If it's not sharp enough, just pinch it and get it sharper. And we're going to do some grains in our door. Ferrule against the ruler. Nice straight lines all the way down. Miss that central section there and carry on. And you can get, once you get going with this, there's no stopping. You get lots of nice grain effects, little cracks in the door. Look out for the shadow on the left of this central wooden beam that's holding the door together. That's the shadow. Just going to go underneath this part here and down the left hand side. And around the left hand side of this heart shaped piece of door furniture, just to remind me later that that's supposed to be there. I'll mix some cobalt blue with some alizarin crimson to get me a nice purpley mauve mix. Do some slightly darker cracks in the door. Back to the cerulean. Now over here there looks like some kind of medieval cat flap. This part here. Get some burnt sienna, just going to put a nice dark in that part where the door is split. Coming down here. Of course, burnt sienna and cobalt blue do make a very nice dark, and I use that quite a lot. It's a very natural looking dark. It doesn't look too intense. The wood has seen better days as it approaches the bottom of the door. Some yellow ochre, pull it up. Door furniture. Now I'm going to put our first area of shadow in, which I'm going to use cobalt blue and some cerulean blue. I'm going to retain the blueness. Shadows are not grey and they're not black. They're a combination of the colours that they are putting into shadow. And sometimes they can be complementary colours. In this case, shadow is a darker version of blue than the door. Remember that we've still got all our masking fluid on here, so we're going to reveal some nice areas of white paper. It's very dark in this corner, so we'll get some nice darks in. I'm just going to drop some burnt sienna into this, which will give us an almost sepia effect. Bit of spattering, dark, that sepia and cobalt blue. Lovely sepia colour, rich. While this area is still wet, I'm going to reinforce it. Rose madder mixed with cobalt blue and cerulean will give you a beautiful aubergine colour. Flick some of this in up here into the shadow area. Just drop some of that in there. And down this section. And finally, for this manoeuvre, I'm just going to reinforce that central bar with a darker mix, aubergine colour, and under our door furniture, and to start to pick out some of the masonry joins, because it's important to remember this is a building that needs to look like it's going to stay up for another 500 years. When we take off our bits of masking paper and fluid, we can again define these dark sections. It's going to come around the inside of that shadowed arch. Okay, so we now been a lot of paint go onto that section. So now I'm going to let that dry thoroughly, and then we're going to come back and remove all our masking fluid and go for a big conclusion. See you in a few minutes. Okay, so painting is almost dry in most of the areas, and it's important before you remove masking fluid to make sure the paint is absolutely dry, and also that your fingers are clean and dry if you want to remove the masking fluid with your fingers. So to remove masking fluid, as I just said, you can rub it with your fingers. You can also use a piece of heavy duty foam. Don't ask me where this came from because I don't know. But anyway, it's a useful tool. So I'm going to start off with this, rubbing some of the masking fluid. She's making the table go wobbly. So if you go dizzy, it's not you, it's the camera shaking. Doing that, I'm also going to take off all these pieces of paper that we stuck on. Sometimes you paint so much over the top of them you can't actually see where you put the paper. I think that's, there's some here. If it tears a little bit of your watercolour paper while you take it off, don't worry about it, it's supposed to happen. And this is the beauty about using heavy duty, thick, heavyweight, good quality watercolour paper. It will take a lot of applications. I'm going to rub off the masking fluid now using this sponge. See, we're revealing lots of white areas, which is okay. When you think you've got all the masking fluid off, there will always be some pieces that you've missed. I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, so we've got lots of white areas of paper, and we're just going to get rid of some of it. So I'm going to use clean water, yellow ochre. I'm just going to glaze into some of these white areas just to remove them. Not all of them, just some of them. Just like that. Going to get some of that lovely cerulean and put it up here on that edge. Touch that edge. Pull it up into that dark section up there, which I think's burnt sienna. Now it's time to just pick out some of the detail with the rigger brush in between the masonry joints. I'm going to use rose madder and cobalt blue, make a nice aubergine purpley colour. Wet into wet. Start to get some of this detail, lots of little flaking pieces of plaster that are in front of this door. There's a nice glaze of beautiful colour. Back to my spattering brush to get some yellow ochre and cerulean. Too much. When you spatter, you need to make the paint quite thick. You don't want it loose, otherwise it'll fly off everywhere. Some more texture on these bricks. one more application of cobalt blue and maybe a touch of rose madder into it. And we go for some darkest darks under this arch here and down this side. Don't want a hard edge on that, so I'm just putting some water to soften that edge. So I think this, normally a painting will tell you when it's time to leave it alone, and this painting is telling me it's had enough now, it's done. So for better or for worse, let's see what we've ended up with. And there we have Door to a Secret Garden in 1 hour.